Picture this. You're having a perfect summer evening. You've got a cold drink, good music playing, the sun is setting, everything is ideal. And then, there it is. That sound. That tiny, infuriating, high-pitched whine right next to your ear. A mosquito. And suddenly your perfect evening is a crime scene. You're slapping yourself in the face, you've knocked over your drink, and you're questioning every life choice that led you to be outside. Sound familiar? Now multiply that frustration by about 8 billion people, add malaria, dengue fever, Zika virus, yellow fever, and West Nile disease, and you start to understand why, at some point, every human being on this planet has stared into the middle distance and thought, what if we just got rid of them? But here's where it gets interesting, because that thought, the deeply satisfying fantasy of eliminating an annoying or dangerous species, opens a door to one of the most complex questions in all of biology. Which animals, if any, would the world actually be better off without? And the answer is almost never what you expect. So today we're going there. We're naming names, we're looking at the candidates, the arguments, the consequences, and the surprising moments where what seems like an obvious answer turns out to be a philosophical and ecological trapdoor. Strap in, because this is the kind of question that sounds simple and then immediately isn't. We have to start with the mosquito because to skip it would be intellectually dishonest. There are over 3,500 species of mosquito on Earth. Of those, only a few hundred bite humans. And of those, only a handful are the heavy hitters in terms of disease transmission. The Anopheles mosquito is responsible for spreading malaria, which kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. The vast majority of them children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Aedes aegypti spreads dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and yellow fever. Culex mosquitoes spread West Nile virus. Taken together, mosquitoes are responsible for more human deaths than any other animal on the planet. More than sharks, more than crocodiles, more than lions, more than every predator that ever made you nervous at the zoo. By a factor that is almost incomprehensible, some estimates suggest mosquito-borne illness has killed more humans throughout history than all wars combined. If there were a trophy for most effective killer of people, the mosquito would need a bigger shelf. So the case for elimination seems airtight, right? Here's the trapdoor. Mosquitoes, for all their menace toward humans, are embedded in ecosystems in ways that make their removal unpredictable at best and catastrophic at worst. Mosquito larvae are a critical food source for fish, particularly in freshwater ecosystems. Remove the larvae, and certain fish populations could collapse. Those fish are eaten by larger fish, by birds, by mammals. That's before you consider that adult mosquitoes are food for bats, birds, dragonflies, and spiders. They also, and this is the part that will shock you, are pollinators. Yes, mosquitoes pollinate plants. Certain orchids in Arctic regions depend specifically on mosquito pollination because almost no other insect operates in those temperatures. Now, scientists have actually been working on something called gene drive technology, which could suppress specific mosquito populations, particularly Anopheles gambiae, the primary malaria vector in Africa, without necessarily nuking every mosquito species from orbit. This is one of the most hotly debated scientific and ethical conversations happening right now. Some researchers argue that the targeted elimination of a single disease-carrying species might be ecologically manageable. Others say we don't understand ecosystem interdependencies well enough to make that call with confidence. The most intellectually honest answer is, we don't fully know, and that uncertainty is worth sitting with because it's going to come up again. Moving on to a creature that inspires less philosophical debate and considerably more immediate screaming, the tsetse fly. Found across sub-Saharan Africa, the tsetse fly is the primary vector for African trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, a parasitic disease that affects both humans and animals. In humans, it starts with fever, headaches, and joint pain, and progresses to confusion, disrupted sleep cycles, and ultimately death if untreated. In cattle and other livestock, it causes nagana, which devastates agricultural economies and contributes to food insecurity across enormous regions. Here's what makes the tsetse fly an interesting case. Unlike the mosquito, which has significant ecological roles that would leave visible gaps if removed, the tsetse fly's ecological contribution is contested. Some ecologists argue that the disease it spreads has historically kept large areas of Africa free from intensive cattle farming, which inadvertently preserved wildlife habitat. The regions where tsetse flies prevent livestock farming are sometimes called the tsetse fly belt, and these areas happen to overlap significantly with some of Africa's most biodiverse wildlife zones. The suffering the fly causes has, as a side effect, created a kind of accidental conservation zone. That is one of the most uncomfortable facts in all of ecology. A parasite parasite vector that kills people and livestock has, completely without intent, preserved millions of acres of wilderness that might otherwise have been converted to farmland. What do you do with that information? It doesn't make the tsetse fly good. It doesn't mean people should continue dying from sleeping sickness, but it does illustrate the terrifying complexity of removing any organism from an ecosystem, especially one that has been part of that system for millions of years. Here's one that might actually unite the entire internet in agreement: the rat. Specifically invasive rat species, primarily the black rat and the brown rat, which have followed human civilization across the globe and wrought ecological havoc on islands, coastlines, and ecosystems that evolved without any rodent predators. Island birds are particularly vulnerable. The dodo didn't die solely from hunting. Introduced rats destroyed nests and eggs, compounding the pressure. In New Zealand, rats introduced by European settlers were a primary driver of extinction for several native bird species, including the huia, whose extinction is one of the most documented and mourned in that country's conservation history. On the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin's living laboratory, black rats have been one of the most destructive invasive forces, decimating populations of endemic birds, reptiles, and plants. Conservation teams have spent years conducting rat eradication programs on individual islands, with some remarkable success stories. After rat removal on Pinzon Island, Galapagos giant tortoise hatchlings survived to adulthood for the first time in over a century. 100 years of failed reproduction fixed by removing one invasive species. Now, and this is important, we're specifically talking about invasive rats in ecosystems where they don't belong. This is not the same question as should rats exist. Rats in their original ecosystems are part of the food web. They aerate soil, disperse seeds, and feed predators from snakes to hawks to foxes. In their native ranges, they're doing their ecological job. The problem is that humans, through shipping and exploration and agriculture, have taken rats everywhere. And in ecosystems that didn't co-evolve with them, they're a wrecking ball. The same logic, interestingly, applies to a number of other invasive species. Feral cats in Australia, responsible for the extinction of multiple native mammals and ongoing catastrophic losses of bird life. Introduced snakes in Guam, the brown tree snake wiped out most of the island's native forest bird species after arriving accidentally in the 1940s. And cane toads in Australia, introduced in 1935 to control beetle pests in sugarcane fields, and now numbering in the hundreds of millions while poisoning the predators that try to eat them. The invasive species conversation is one where the answer to "would the world be better without this animal?" changes entirely depending on the word where. Let's talk about something that will make you feel things you didn't expect: the sea lamprey. The sea lamprey is a jawless, parasitic fish, eel-like in appearance, ancient in origin, and deeply unpleasant to look at if you happen to stumble upon one without warning. It attaches to other fish using a circular, tooth-lined sucker mouth, rasps through scales, and feeds on blood and body fluids. Its host often dies. It looks like something a nightmare would draw if it were specifically trying to ruin your relationship with water. Sea lampreys are native to the Atlantic Ocean and certain rivers where they serve a legitimate ecological purpose. As larvae, they filter sediment. As adults, when they die after spawning, their decomposing bodies provide nutrients to river ecosystems. Fine, they belong there. The Atlantic manages. The issue is the Great Lakes. Sea lampreys entered the Great Lakes through shipping canals in the early 20th century and detonated through the fish populations there. Lake trout, whitefish, and other commercially valuable species were nearly wiped out. The collapse of Great Lakes fisheries in the mid-20th century was economically devastating and ecologically profound. Today, management agencies spend tens of millions of dollars annually on lamprey control, chemical treatments, barriers, trapping programs, just to keep populations at manageable levels. The moment that spending stops, populations rebound fast. Is the sea lamprey a villain? In the Atlantic, no. In the Great Lakes, it's one of the most destructive invasive species in North American history. Same animal, different zip code, completely different ecological verdict. Now, here's an entry that will divide the comment section: the common wasp. Before you nod enthusiastically, hold on. Wasps, specifically the common yellow jacket varieties that ruin your picnic, hover aggressively near your soda can and sting you for no apparent reason other than the purest spite, are one of the most complained about insects in the temperate world. Unlike bees, which can only sting once and die afterward, which gives them a kind of noble, tragic quality, wasps can sting multiple times, seem to do so enthusiastically, and do not appear to feel bad about it. But here is the thing that wasp defenders, yes, they exist, will tell you. Wasps are significant predators of pest insects. A single wasp colony can eliminate thousands of caterpillars, flies, and other agricultural pests over a season. They are, in their own grumpy, aggressive way, doing pest control. They also contribute to pollination, though less efficiently than bees, and some plant species do rely on wasp pollination specifically. In late summer, wasp colonies begin to die off, and workers that were previously feeding larvae, which require protein, suddenly have no larvae to feed. They shift to seeking sugar instead. This is when wasp behavior becomes most erratic and confrontational. The wasps you're meeting at your barbecue are technically dying. They're nutritionally desperate and their colony is collapsing. This does not make the sting hurt less, but it does add a small, unwanted layer of sympathy. The ecological role of wasps is real. Their removal would likely result in increased populations of the insects they prey upon, with cascading effects on crops and plant life. Studies have found that in areas where wasps are suppressed, certain caterpillar pest populations spike within a single growing season. Are they annoying? Profoundly. Would the world be better without them? The agriculture sector would probably say no, while simultaneously saying it very quietly. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's go somewhere that feels less ambiguous. The crown of thorns starfish. This is a predatory starfish, heavily spined, venomous, and capable of consuming coral at a rate that sounds made up until you look it up. A single crown of thorns starfish can eat up to 6 square meters of living coral reef per year. Under normal conditions, they exist in populations that reefs can absorb. Under outbreak conditions, triggered by nutrient runoff from agriculture, which fuels algae blooms that feed their larvae, populations can explode to millions of individuals across a single reef system. The crown of thorns is believed to be one of the primary natural threats to the Great Barrier Reef, second only to climate change-induced bleaching. Outbreaks have stripped enormous sections of reef down to bare calcium skeletons. Recovery takes decades. Multiple outbreaks in succession can prevent recovery entirely. Here's the nuance. In non-outbreak conditions, the crown of thorns actually plays a role in reef ecology by preying on fast-growing coral species, which theoretically allows slower-growing, more structurally complex corals to compete. Their presence, in low numbers, contributes to coral diversity. The animal itself is not the problem. The human-caused nutrient runoff that creates the conditions for explosive population growth is the problem. This pattern, organism fine, human-created conditions turn organism into catastrophe, shows up repeatedly in these conversations. It's one of the less comfortable threads running through this topic. Here's a wild card: the common vampire bat. Found in Central and South America, vampire bats feed exclusively on blood, mostly from livestock, occasionally from wild mammals, and in rare cases from humans. They do carry and transmit rabies, which is a legitimate public health concern in rural Latin American communities, where the disease is both dangerous and difficult to treat. Livestock farmers in particular have lost animals to vampire bat transmitted rabies, and the economic impact is significant. Public health efforts have sometimes led to indiscriminate killing of bat populations, targeting not just vampire bats, but the hundreds of other bat species that share roosting sites. And here is where this gets complicated extremely fast, because bats as a group are among the most ecologically valuable mammals on Earth. Insectivorous bats consume enormous quantities of agricultural pests. The economic value of pest control provided by North American bats alone has been estimated in the billions of dollars annually. Fruit bats pollinate hundreds of plant species and disperse seeds across vast distances. The durian, yes, the famously pungent fruit beloved across Southeast Asia, is pollinated almost exclusively by bats. Tequila exists in part because bats pollinate agave plants. If you enjoy tequila and durian, bats deserve a toast. Killing vampire bat populations without surgical precision inevitably damages all of this. And the methods that have been used, wide-spectrum culling, have at times made rabies transmission worse because disrupted bat populations with weakened immunity spread disease more readily, not less. Targeted, specific management of vampire bat populations near livestock, potentially defensible, broad elimination, the ecosystem consequences and the economic consequences make it extraordinarily counterproductive. Here's one that feels like it should be a straightforward case: the Asian giant hornet. Known in headlines as the murder hornet, partly because of its venom, partly because of what it does to honeybees. The Asian giant hornet is the world's largest hornet, about the size of your thumb if your thumb were an absolute nightmare. And a single scout can mark a honeybee hive and direct a group of hornets to destroy it entirely within hours. Thousands of bees slaughtered. The hornets then occupy the hive, feed the bee larvae to their own young, and leave. It is a horror movie that plays out in the insect world with disturbing regularity in parts of East Asia, where the hornet is native. When Asian giant hornets were discovered in the Pacific Northwest of North America, first confirmed in 2019, the reaction was, to put it mildly, panicked. Honeybee populations are already under severe pressure from pesticides, habitat loss, and disease. The last thing they needed was a thumb-sized apex insect predator showing up uninvited. Eradication efforts were launched immediately. As of recent years, active populations in Washington state have not been confirmed, suggesting control efforts may have been successful, though monitoring continues. This is a case where early, targeted intervention against an invasive species before it established a foothold is considered the responsible call by virtually every ecologist involved. In its native range in East Asia, the Asian giant hornet fills an ecological niche. It preys on bees. Yes, but Asian honeybees there have co-evolved defensive strategies, including a behavior called heat balling, where hundreds of bees surround a hornet and vibrate, generating enough heat to cook it alive, which is both terrifying and magnificent. Ecosystems adapt to their pressures. New ecosystems with species that never faced that specific pressure cannot. Now, here is the most philosophically thorny entry on this entire list: the human botfly. If you don't know what a botfly is, here is a brief, deeply unpleasant summary. The human botfly, Dermatobia hominis, lays its eggs on mosquitoes or other insects, which then transfer the eggs to warm mammalian skin. The larvae burrow in and develop subcutaneously, meaning under the skin, for up to 3 months, breathing through a small hole in the surface before emerging as adult flies. This happens to people. In Central and South America, it's not rare. The removal process is something that has fueled an entire genre of oddly popular, deeply disturbing internet video. The sensation of hosting one is described as periodic, sharp pain, and the psychological experience of knowing something is living in your skin is, by most accounts, uniquely horrible. The ecological role of the botfly is minor. It parasitizes mammals but does not appear to provide services, pollination, seed dispersal, pest control, that cannot be provided by other means. Its larvae feed on subcutaneous tissue and then emerge to continue the fly life cycle. From a narrow ecosystem services perspective, the human botfly is one of the weaker cases for irreplaceability, and yet removing any parasitic species tends to have ripple effects. Parasites are prey. Botfly pupae in soil are eaten by beetles, birds, and small mammals. Disrupting parasite populations can alter predator-prey balances in ways that are hard to model. Also, and this is the strangest part of this whole conversation, botfly larvae have been studied for potential biomedical applications. The mechanisms by which they suppress their host's immune response are being investigated for potential relevance to transplant medicine and autoimmune research. Something that makes you desperately want to claw your own skin off might, in a laboratory context, hold clues to helping people whose immune systems attack their own bodies. Biology is deeply uncomfortable sometimes. Let's circle back and sit with the bigger picture for a moment, because it's worth articulating what this whole exercise has been pointing toward. Every single case we've explored breaks down into roughly the same structure. There is an animal causing harm to humans, to livestock, to ecosystems, and the immediate, understandable response is to want it gone. But when you pull on the thread, you find that gone is rarely clean. Ecosystems are not modular. You cannot simply subtract one component and get everything else minus that thing. You get something different, and different in a system that evolved over millions of years tends to mean unstable. The cases where removal is most clearly defensible are consistently the invasive species cases. Organisms in ecosystems where they don't belong, where they evolved, where nothing else co-adapted to their presence. Rats on islands, snakes in Guam, Asian giant hornets in North America. These aren't ecological villains. They're ecological mismatches created by human movement, and correcting those mismatches by restoring the original condition, removing the invasive organism, is supported by strong conservation science. The native species cases are murkier. Mosquitoes, tsetse flies, botflies, crown of thorns starfish, vampire bats. In their native ranges, each has ecological threads running through it that connect to other species, other processes, other dependencies that we often don't fully understand until something disrupts them. The history of of conservation is littered with well-intentioned interventions that backfired. Cane toads introduced to control beetles, now an uncontrollable pest. Wolves eliminated from Yellowstone, causing deer populations to explode and riverbanks to erode, with cascading effects that took decades to untangle after the wolves were reintroduced. Ecology is humbling in that way. The more you learn, the less certain you become about quick fixes. There is one more category worth addressing directly, because otherwise the comments section will bring it up, and they won't be wrong. Animals that harm humans in very direct, very personal ways. Crocodiles kill hundreds of people every year, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia. Hippopotamuses are responsible for significant human fatalities across African river systems. Box jellyfish in Australian and Indo-Pacific waters kill people with venom that is among the most potent of any organism on Earth. Cape buffalo have a reputation among African hunters as among the most dangerous large animals alive. Nile crocodiles, specifically, are responsible for more human fatalities than any other large predator. Are any of these animals candidates for elimination? Here's the consistent ecological answer: no. Every one of them fills a role. Crocodiles are apex predators that regulate fish populations, cycle nutrients, and whose presence shapes the behavior of every other animal near their waterways. Hippos, despite their aggression, are critical contributors to African river ecosystems. Their dung fertilizes rivers, supporting fish and algae that feed the entire food web. Box jellyfish are part of marine food webs, and their removal would affect the fish and turtles that feed on them. The human deaths caused by these animals are tragedies, and the communities that live in proximity to them deserve resources, infrastructure, and support to reduce conflict. That is a different conversation from elimination. It is also arguably the more useful one, because elimination is a fantasy, while conflict mitigation is a set of actual, achievable interventions. Here's the takeaway that this entire journey has been quietly building toward. The question, which animals would the world be better without, is, at its core, a question about what we think nature is for. If nature is for human comfort and safety, the list is long. Mosquitoes, botflies, tsetse flies, vampire bats, hornets, ticks, wasps, all gone. Great. Where do I sign? But if nature is a system, one that we are embedded in, dependent on, and incapable of fully modeling, then the question shifts. The more scientifically accurate version becomes, which disruptions to ecosystems caused by human movement of species are reversible and worth reversing? And the answer to that question is specific, careful, and based on evidence. It's the kind of answer that doesn't make for a satisfying late-night rant, but does make for a planet that continues to function. There's a reason the species most confidently supported for targeted removal, specific invasive populations in specific places, are supported by ecologists who've spent careers in the data. And there's a reason those same ecologists become very, very careful when the conversation shifts to native species, even deeply harmful ones. It's because they've seen what happens when certainty outruns understanding. The mosquito that wrecked your summer evening? We've been trying to get rid of it for generations, and the problems are still there. The invasive rat wiped out on a small island? The seabirds came back within years. The wolf reintroduced to Yellowstone? Rivers literally changed course. Every one of those outcomes was surprising to someone. And that's the thing about the natural world. Just when you think you've found the obvious answer, something alive and ancient and deeply strange proves that you haven't been asking the right question, which is either deeply frustrating or deeply fascinating, depending on your relationship with uncertainty. For the record, the mosquito still ruined your evening. That part remains indefensible.